So we're starting a new series from this week. We're going back to the Old Testament. We're going to look at the book of Daniel. And I've titled the series as, Gospel According to Daniel. That might raise some eyebrows and questions because when we hear the word gospel, we tend to associate it to only the first 4 books of the New Testament, or the gospel is a New Testament thing. But what I want us to be able to see is that the whole Bible is the gospel. Gospel basically means good news. And that is the meaning of the word gospel. And Daniel especially is a very special book about good news. It's a book that brings good news for a people who have lost almost everything. Daniel is written to the Israelites when they are in exile. They have been exiled from their home. They are living in Babylon. These are people who have lost their homes, who have lost their loved ones, who have lost their lands, their jobs, their positions, their place of worship. And that's not the end of it. The worst still, they're now living in an unknown place that has a very different culture that they can connect to, separated from their families, and they're made to serve the very ones who have caused and inflicted so much pain and suffering upon them. What more worse thing can happen to anyone in the world? So for people in such a situation, God has some good news, and that's the gospel. And he gives people who are living in such a very fragile situation a man named Daniel. And he is a very unique figure in the Old Testament. We'll see that as we go through this book. And this book is a very unique book compared to any other Old Testament book. Daniel has 2 parts to it. It's partly narrative, like the stories we read in Genesis or Exodus or Leviticus or Kings. But it also has amazing apocalyptic prophecies towards the second part. It has 6 narratives which are mostly autobiographical of what happens to Daniel in his life and his friends. And there are 4 grand apocalyptic visions that have captivated the minds and hearts of theologians and churches and pastors over the centuries. And so God is giving this book to the people in exile. Daniel is writing it for them who are going through such difficult times. And I'm sure this book, the same good news that applied to them in their situation, can apply to all of us who have either experienced loss, or you live in a very hostile work environment or hostile school environment. And particularly to us as a church, and not just our church, the church as a whole, as we are living in an increasingly hostile, anti-Christian culture. There are several significant truths that we can glean from the book of Daniel that can be applied to our lives. So this first chapter, I've given a title as Wise Living in a Smart World. Now, how do you engage or how do you live when you go through so much loss and you're living in an environment that's so hostile to you and to everything that you believe in? And when you look at this world around us, it is becoming what everyone calls as an increasingly smart world, isn't it? We have smart watches, smart phones, smart everything. Because sometimes the inherent assumption behind that is the solution to all our life's problems can come through technology if only we can apply smartness to automate everything. But when we get hit with some significant loss or pain or suffering, we realize none of these smart things can really help us in life's big challenges. I had not gone to Sunday school, but I know one of the popular themes when we talk about the book of Daniel is the song, perhaps many of you know, which says, "Dare to be a Daniel." Well, I have to break it to you. Unfortunately, that is not the theme of this book. God is not calling us to become like Daniel merely, although his life is very exemplary and noteworthy, and there are several things that we can seek to emulate in our lives. What God is calling us is to emulate the faith of Daniel. Now, Daniel's faith that made him to dare this world around him in a most hostile environment came from Daniel's view and experience of a big God. So I hope as we go through the series, we will not end up merely with a bunch of moral challenges of being like Daniel or doing like Daniel, that we will catch the glimpse of this big God that Daniel got a glimpse of and believed and worshiped. And we see how big God is in life's challenging situations through his biographical experiences, as well as some of the greatest, grandest descriptions of God and images we can see in these apocalyptic visions that Daniel has towards the end. So I hope this book will encourage us to examine our own views of God and also see how huge God is and how he is yet intimately involved in our daily grind of our lives. And when we read the book of Hebrews, that is exactly what Hebrews calls us to do. Daniel's faith is commended in Hebrews because it is a faith that comes from Daniel's God, who is a big God. Now, the key to unlocking this first chapter of Daniel lies in three repetitive phrases. That's the first exercise we always do, is to look for what are some recurring themes or words. And there are three key words you can miss if you read it very rapidly. But when you pause and read, the three words that we read are the words God gave. We read in verse 2, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. We read in verse 9, the Lord gave compassion and mercy. And in verse 17, we read, the Lord gave wisdom for Daniel. So we're going to look at these three nuggets and in this whole narrative and see what are some truths that we can apply to our lives. So to be able to live in situations where we have experienced significant challenges or in a hostile environment, God's prescription to us as his children is to not be smart, but to live with his wisdom. Wise living. So we read in the first two verses, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. The phrase, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, Daniel intentionally puts this in here to remind his fellow brothers and sisters in exile that wise living begins by acknowledging who owns history and our story. He wants them to remember that they have to live with the wise thoughts by acknowledging no matter what happens in their life, God is in control. It was God who gave this king the ability to come and take them as hostile. When we get blessings from God, we are very quick to acknowledge it and receive it and thank God from it. But when God allows pain or suffering into our lives, when we go through a difficult time, it's hard for us to acknowledge that this thing is coming from God, isn't it? But wise living recognizes that no pain or suffering can come into our life unless God allows it. Now, how did this happen and why are they in exile? And Daniel wants to remind them of that. In fact, this was not an accident. This was not a spur of the moment thing that happened in their lives. In Leviticus, way back, chapter 26, the Lord had warned Israel of sure consequences of their sins if they do not keep the covenant. He makes a covenant with them, a covenant that included blessings and curses if they disobeyed. Especially, if you read verse 33 and 39, he says if they persisted in their disobedience in Leviticus chapter 26, the Lord would scatter them among the nations and they would waste away in exile. God already told them this. This was not news to them. And that's exactly what unfolded in their life because of their persistent disobedience and rebellion against God over many, many generations. God finally handed them over into the power of their enemies. They wanted a king, and God gave them king after king after king. And all of the kings thought that they can rule the world in their smartness and failed to rely on the wisdom of God that led them to this situation. And Jehoiakim happened to be the last king. If you read his life, those who are reading Power Reading, this week happens to be when we are in 1 Kings and 2 Kings and Chronicles. We are reading all the kings. When you read in Big Shot, you see a very sad line. And this king did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Again and again and again. That was one of the reasons why they are being sent to exile. But there is a specific reason why Babylon and why here. And this is something that goes a couple of generations before to the time of King Hezekiah. And you read his story in 2 Kings chapter 20, where Hezekiah is one of those few kings who actually happened to live a life that was pleasing to God. He went and destroyed all the idols and he tried to follow the decrees, and yet he was plagued with the sickness and was about to die. And then he prays and asks God to give him some more time, and God graciously gives him 15 more years. Now you would think that someone who receives such an amazing blessing would want to live the rest of their life in gratitude and serving God faithfully, trusting him even more. Sadly, the exact opposite happens. We read in 2 Kings 20 verse 18, Judah's king Hezekiah, he received envoys and a gift from Merodach-Baladan, king of Babylon. In response, Hezekiah showed them everything that was of value in his storehouse and all of his treasures. 20 verse 13. And Isaiah he condemns him roundly and says, Hezekiah, you upset the Lord by showing him all of this. Now, what was the problem with giving the envoys from Babylon a royal tour of the palace? Dr. Ian Duguid, he's an Old Testament scholar and one of my professors at Westminster. He goes a little into the background of this, and this is what he says. He says the reason why God is upset with Hezekiah showing all of his treasures off to this Babylonian king is that in the world of ancient diplomacy, nothing came free. When Merodach-Baladan sent envoys and a gift to Hezekiah, it wasn't merely a friendly gesture of goodwill on his recovery from sickness. Rather, he was soliciting Hezekiah's help and support in his ongoing struggle with Assyria, because Assyria was on their heels attacking Babylon. So it was a geopolitical move. So when Hezekiah showed his envoys around his treasured houses, he was responding positively to this Babylonian king's overtures of alliance and seeking to show him that he had the resources to be an ally to tame Assyria, because he felt if the Assyrians come, he needed now not the help of his God who gave him life, who extended him grace. Now he felt he needed, in his smartness, he thought it would be a smart move to make an alliance with the Babylonian king, and starts to trust in him. And his faith had shifted. How sad that is, isn't it? Even after receiving the grace of God, he goes back to his stubborn, proud ways, failing to live the rest of his life humbly, thanking God for the gift of life, and seeking to do even way more than what he should have been doing before. He falls and fails, and that sin doesn't just affect him, it affects the entire generations after him. So Isaiah pronounces judgment on Hezekiah's strategy. He says in 2 Kings 20, verse 17, 18, says, because Hezekiah sought to preserve his treasures by trusting in Babylon, he said, the Babylonians are coming. They would come and carry off everything in his palace. Far from assuring the security of his children and grandchildren, his foolish spiritual alliance would result in some of his own offspring being taken off to become eunuchs in the palace of the Babylonian king. And this specific word of judgment is fulfilled in the opening verses of the book of Daniel. You see, when the kings start relying on their smartness to solve their problems, rather than trusting in God's wisdom and going to him, this is what happens. That's what we tend to do, isn't it? When we go through life's challenges, our first response tends to be, let me fix this by myself. Let me go to this person or this panel of experts, or trust this group of people or this boss or this particular set of friends who will love me and take me in so my problem can be resolved, rather than trusting God and not on his riches. All they needed to be reminded was that God was a covenantal God. And that's what Daniel reminds them. Well, now I know we are all in exile, my dear friends. Our treasures are gone, our homes are gone, our families are gone, our relationships are gone. It's not because King Nebuchadnezzar had the power to take it away. It's because our God allowed this. But remember, our God is a covenantal God. He is going to walk with us. He is going to restore us. And that's what we need to have, the attitude when we go through challenges in our life. The good news that Daniel is trying to remind them, even through these painful situations, number one is, first, remember, God has allowed this in your life. And secondly, remember, he will walk with you during this painful time, and he wants you to walk with him and hold on to him. And thirdly, he's going to show them in very vivid detail how God will deliver you and accomplish great and mighty things even through these painful experiences in the future. That's walking in wisdom than in smartness. Where though our immediate effort tends to be, let me do this or this or this or this to fix it, it is to examine our hearts, examine our pride, examine our insecurities. Are there things still in our life that we are stubbornly resisting to let God and let others come in and help us and work. And trust that God is going to use this to do something beautiful. He is with us, even through those most challenging times. And then we follow the narrative. What happens in Babylon? There are 3 scenes. Now, the first scene is the one that happens when King Jehoiakim is taken captive. Now, the second scene is happening in Babylon. It says, then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. You know, the very first thing we read is when the king brings all the treasures, he brings them to a place called Shinar, which comes in Genesis 11, which is where the people built the Tower of Babel. And perhaps the name Babylon comes from that. So here was a place where humankind decided their smartness is going to help them rule the world and solve life's problems. And that is where all the action is happening in this place. Nebuchadnezzar was at that time one of the greatest kings. He thought he can rewrite history. But he doesn't remember that God is the one who writes history. Nebuchadnezzar thought he could rewrite history with his smartness by bringing smart people, making them smarter through his smart training, and accomplishing his smart goals. You know, Silicon Valley, we can call as the modern day Shinar, isn't it? The 4 people who were brought in were still teenagers. Can you believe that? Less than 20 years old. And they were going to be reprogrammed and reconfigured in every possible way. They were given good Hebrew names. Their names had significant meanings. Daniel, El is the name for Yahweh or God, and Daniel means God is my judge. Hananiah means the Lord is gracious. Mishael means who is what God is. And Azariah means the Lord is a helper. Now what happened was for them, their names were changed to Babylonian names, Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And each of these names invoked the help of Babylonian gods. And those were the gods Marduk, Bel, and Nebo. So they thought by changing the names of these people and making their names reflect the Babylonian gods, they can reprogram their minds. The battle is always for their minds, isn't it? And they were given training in their language and literature and even their food habits. For 3 years, Nebuchadnezzar thought that this smart move would erase God's memory from their minds. It was in one way or the other, he thought was a smart way to obliterate all memory of Israel and Israel's God from the lips and minds of these young men and install into them a total dependence on Nebuchadnezzar for all things in life. And this is where comes the pivotal verse in the book of Daniel. Perhaps many of you are familiar or even memorized this verse, Daniel 1, verse 8. Let's read that verse, the first part of the verse together. Daniel chapter 1, verse 8. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with what he drank. Daniel resolves to not defile himself. And in the very next verse, once Daniel resolves this, comes our second God gave. What does God give Daniel? In verse 9 it says, and God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of eunuchs. Now, wise living, our second point, calls us to live faithfully to God even in hostile situations. By the way, your sermon, the bulletins you have has a small place for sermon notes. And if you're interested, you can take this down. That's why we are not putting it up on the slides too, so you can listen and write it. Wise living calls us to resolve to live faithfully to God even in hostile situations. Now the question is, why would Daniel not want to defile himself? What is there in a food? He's let them change his name. He's willing to go and learn their culture. He's willing to take in the education and all of that lifestyle. What is there in a food? And that's a very important question. And there could be various reasons. Old Testament scholars say that could be why. Perhaps it violated the dietary laws that God gave Israelites, but then even the vegetables were not exempt from that. Perhaps they were sacrificed to their gods. Well, that doesn't apply either. But Daniel is picking his battle very wisely and very clearly here. Because if he takes this food, and the king has given a very specific command, was that by this, he thought is what is going to make them the best, he would be forced to give all the glory to the king and not to God. So he wants to demonstrate in that environment that when we choose to be faithful to God, he will give us favor and compassion, and so he resolves to not defile himself so God can get the glory. And it can be hard in challenging life situations to take this stand, where the cost may be huge, where you are called to do something in your place of work that may be ethically not right, but may guarantee you a raise or a promotion. I remember when I was working in the tech world, we had a fellowship called X-Men's Fellowship, because that was the starting letter of the company I used to work for, and then everyone went to work for different companies. They were all executives in different companies. So we met after 6 months, and one of the executives, these are all wonderful Christian men, and he was sharing over lunch how he was called to sign an ethically not correct contract, and that would have helped them to get millions of dollars in revenue, and he refused it. He said, my integrity is more valuable to me than the millions of dollars that this company can make, and it cost him his job. You see, this is real. And God was gracious to him, and he was doing incredibly well in a different place, at a higher position, and all of that. But wise living calls us to live faithfully to God, trusting that he will give us the grace and compassion we need for that. You know, Jonathan Edwards, when he was even less than 20 years old, as a young man, he decided to make a few resolutions in his life. And you can read, there are 70 resolutions Jonathan Edwards made as a teenager before he turned 20 about what is the kind of life he wants to live. And I can read just one of them. He says, resolved never to do anything which I should be afraid to do. If I expected, it would not be above an hour before I should hear the last trumpet. You see, faithful living requires us to trust God to take care of us even when we take a stand for Him wherever He does. So what is your resolution? I would encourage you in whatever situation you are in, whether in your work or your school or your neighborhood, what is your resolution? What are your challenges? And where do you want to see God work in giving you the grace and compassion you need to take a stand that you may have to take? And then we move on to the third section, which talks about, verse 17, as for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. You see, the beautiful thing about this, in all these things you see, is God gave and God gave and God gave. And that is the take-home message for us to remember. God always gives us exactly what we need to go through in our most challenging life situations. He is near us. He is present with us. If we need compassion and grace, He will give us. If we need wisdom and learning and skills, He is going to give us if we resolve to walk in His ways. It says in verse 18, at the end of the time when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And what you see here beautiful is they are not now being called by their Babylonian names, they are called by their Hebrew names. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. And if you look at it from the first verse till now, what it's talking about is there are several kings that pass after Nebuchadnezzar. It takes 70 years before King Cyrus becomes the king, and it's at the end of 70 years that those who are in exile were taken back to Jerusalem to live again. And God's promise actually came through. Daniel lived to see the goodness of God. Daniel lived to see the faithfulness of God. Daniel lived to taste and experience the covenantal love of God towards his covenantal people. What God gave Daniel was wisdom. Wisdom to influence rather than to get influenced. And that's our third point. Wise living calls us to be influencers than becoming influenced. You know, we live in the age of social media where the social media has democratized people who can influence one another. You no longer need to be a sports icon or a movie star or a politician to wield influence. You just need a cell phone which has a camera and do something, and there's always a following of people to watch, and the reels and all those things is what does that. You know, but what God is calling and what Daniel did was, he says, when we encounter something challenging, most of us tend to do one of two things. We tend to go into a shell and disengage and try to separate ourselves from everyone or everything. Or we just give up, fully compromise, and try to assimilate in order to fit in. Or if I don't do these things, my friends will not accept me. All right, let me just do that. Well, if I don't do this thing, my boss will not acknowledge. All right, let me just do that. But what we see here is happening is these men, Daniel and his friends, lived with dual identities, but were very clear of where their allegiance was and what God was requiring them to do. And if we go back again a little bit to history, what the king does when he goes to Jerusalem before it is destroyed is he attacks Jerusalem. The first time, he takes 10,000 of the best men and women of Jerusalem. These were the brightest, smartest people. And for Nebuchadnezzar, he thought, if he takes away the brightest people, Israel will not try to rebel or revolt against him, and that would be victory enough. And he left the older people, the peasants and the farmers to live there, and he brought these people in. And we read what happens when these people move to Babylon is they don't want to enter into the city. So they live by and settle down near Nippur on a canal called the Khyber Canal, some distance away from the city, and that's where they pen these words. They are sad of the loss, and they write, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. And they don't want to engage into this city of Babylon. So God raises the prophet Jeremiah, and before Jeremiah, in Jeremiah chapter 28, there was another false prophet called Hananiah who reinforced that message for them. He told them, don't move into the city. That's a wicked city. It's the source of Babylonian culture. Have nothing to do with it. Don't live in there. Stay out. Pray against the city. We prophets foresee that God will judge the city and we will come back out on top. We will have the cultural power. God is going to judge it and he's going to put us back in charge. That was the false prophecy they received to reinforce what they were believing. But then Jeremiah, the true prophet of God, back in Judah, still heard about this and wrote them a letter. The revealed will of God for the exiles, and this is what his letter said. It became the blueprint for Daniel's life. He was living according to this word. Jeremiah 29, verse 4, it says, this is what the Lord says to the exiles in Babylon, build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce, marry and have sons and daughters, find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage. Increase in numbers there, do not decrease. Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Do not let the prophets and diviners among you deceive you. This was a theme we even saw at our retreat, isn't it? This must have been absolutely astounding to the people who listened. This seems counterintuitive to what you would think God would ever say. He says three things that must have been very astonishing to them. The first thing he's saying is, get a bigger picture of what I am doing. This is a city which I carried you into. It's part of my plan that you lost the cultural power. It's part of my plan that now as believers, you are living in this wicked pagan city. And there is a reason I did this. It is part of my plan to renew you and to change you and to grow you. It's also part of my plan to change them and grow them and renew them. It's part of my plan to get my word out into the world. Your loss of cultural power, you now needing to live as believers in an unbelieving world, is part of my plan. He says, I designed this. Move in there, get in there. Don't stay away. I took away Christendom. I took away the cultural power in this country. I spread you among the pagan cities of the world, including Silicon Valley. The second thing he tells them is, but I refuse to let you believe the only choices you have are either assimilation or separation. Those are not the only two choices, and we tend to think in either or categories. The prophets are saying, stay out, or else you'll get in there and you'll assimilate and you'll lose your identity. So don't assimilate, separate. But God is saying, those two are not your only choices. On the one hand, he says, don't assimilate, don't lose your identity. He said, increase in number there, do not decrease. That means don't lose your identity. Don't melt in. Don't just become like the Babylonians. Know who you are. Know the number of believers. Stay in a covenant relationship with me. Keep your identity. Do not assimilate. But on the other hand, he says, build houses, settle down, plant gardens, eat what they produce, marry and have sons and daughters. And he says, seek the prosperity of the city. He's saying, I want you to be deeply involved in influencing all spheres of life in the city, economically and culturally. I want you to raise your families there. I want you to be deeply involved in the life and the heartbeat of the city, engaged in it, but living distinctively as my people, influencing them rather than getting influenced. You don't have to assimilate, you don't have to segregate. You stand right in the middle and you permeate my influence through all spheres of that by being my children. And how do you do that? How do you be an influencer rather than getting influenced? He gives very specific, simple applications. He says, number one, pray for the city. I think God has brought us to live here in Silicon Valley, which is so anti-God, and there's so many cultural problems and political issues all the time. God wants us first, if we want to influence the city, is to pray for our cities. You know, it was wonderful to go on these prayer walks. I was just telling Jimmy when we should have done this long ago. And as our retreat speaker, Tim, told us, you live in the city, but does the city live in you? And when you go on a prayer walk, the city starts living in you. You start seeing things that affect your heart. You're going to hear this morning from our people who went for all these prayer walks. You cannot influence your city if you don't have a heart for your city. You cannot have a heart for your city if you do not start praying for your city and asking God to give you the same compassion and mercy. You know, most of us, as we are immigrants, we come with this attitude of what can I take from this city and send it back home to India or other places. It's totally fine. It's wonderful. You should do that. You know, when God has blessed us with abundance, we should bless others with that. But what are you giving? Do you love the city? Do you believe that God brought you here? God put you here? You didn't come here by your own choice. And if you are here, then God calls us, hey, are you being influenced by the city? Do you want to get what most people's dream is to get Americanized? And especially for children who are born in this country and are struggling with the question of identity, the biggest thing they want is to become an American citizen. And part of that involves doing everything this culture does. No. That is not what is God's plan for us. He says, I want you, as my children, you're my covenant people, to influence this place. You can go to the best schools, pursue the greatest education you want, learn it, but then be my light in those places. But if your goal and desire is to only go after this education and academics and performance and what you're pursuing is not very different from anyone who doesn't know God pursues, then you are assimilating into this culture rather than permeating it with godly influence. Pray for the city. Pray for your street. Pray for your neighbors as you go on a prayer walk. Start praying for them. And you will start to see a love, a new love come in your heart for them. And second, he says, seek the peace or shalom of the city, because if it prospers, you will prosper. You know, the word shalom is not just like a hi bye, it means complete well being. You know, God starts showing you the brokenness that are there around you, that the needs that people have around you. And you will be amazed. It all starts with prayer. When one thing after the other, you're able to start being an influence. The prophet said, pray against it. God says, pray for it. And third, how can you permeate and influence the place that you are in, is to see what God wants to do with your life through your profession. You know, I was talking to one of the guys who helped co-write a book on technology and faith, and he happens to work in AI. And I asked him, we were in a dinner meeting, hey, have you thought about a theology of AI? And he said, yeah, I actually have the domain name for it. Now, as a Christian, you and I are called not just to go to work to get money. You need to be able to see what is the theology of my profession, what is the theology of coding, what is the theology of tech, what is the theology of science, what is the theology of teaching. Find your jobs in the Bible and see how can I influence and permeate the place where I am through that. If you're in school, be part of clubs. You know, join and help clubs. And a simple thing to do, this may be too big, a baby step for everyone to do is, wherever you are, get plugged in to some of those local activities. If your children are involved in some sports, volunteer there. And this was a learning for me. It took me several years to do it last year. It was such a blessing to be involved in Little League. I got to know families. I got to know their stories. I got to know their hurts, their brokenness, formed friendships. I wish I had started this way back, because we've been living in the separatist mode and not really connected. It's very simple. Whatever your family is involved in, get involved in your city. Volunteer in the library. We do have a few programs at church, like our Kids Club and International Outreach. That's not the only thing you have to do. You can do right where you live. Get a meal to an old person who's probably living down the street who can't go for shopping. That's living in the city. Pray for them. See what you have, what God has given you with which you can bless them. Tutor your neighbor's kids. Clean up their yards if you want to. Coach them. Mentor them. A very, very simple thing. Invite your neighbor home for dinner and share a meal with them. Someone who doesn't know God. Build genuine, authentic friendship. Give them love for free with nothing in expectation. Those are the ways in which we can influence. And Daniel had a way more significant influence than that. You know, Daniel's presence, him and his friends, he was the beacon of light. He didn't just take the education from the Babylonian culture, he gave them a knowledge of God that was so deeply embedded. Some theologians believe that when the wise man who came from the east to find Jesus, how did they know about Jesus? Where did they find out about how and when and where Jesus was born? It was through Daniel and his friends permeating that culture with the knowledge of God and the scriptures of God, that they was left behind even when the exiles went back to Jerusalem. You see the impact? Now that's some influence. And if the Lord could keep these young men faithful to him in their situation, he's surely able to keep us faithful in much lesser trials and difficulties, my dear friends. No matter how overwhelming our situation is, our God is able to keep us through it. This theme of the faithfulness of God emerges in this 21st verse. Like I mentioned earlier, it says, Daniel lived until the first year of Cyrus, where some of the Jews, after 70 years, were able to finally go home. So we are thus reminded that God's faithfulness proved sufficient for Daniel throughout the time of exile. Babylonian kings came and went. The Babylonians themselves were replaced by another major world power, the Medo-Persians. Daniel lived to see that in the person of Cyrus. Yet God sustained Daniel and his covenant people through the whole time, and he is able to sustain and preserve you and me through our trials and tribulations, no matter how intense they may be or how long they last. When the world does its worst, God's faithfulness is enough. And the story doesn't end with the book of Daniel, isn't it? There was something who was greater than Daniel, who was exiled. Christ Jesus himself was exiled. He was exiled from heaven into earth. But God's plan was accomplished through that exile at last. Though Daniel received favor and compassion, Christ did not receive favor and compassion to those who put him on the cross. But he offers us favor and compassion when we go to him and confess that we have not been faithful as we ought to have been. How we gave in to our weaknesses, how we succumbed to our faulty thinking and went after things of the world. He is able to forgive that for you and me. And ultimately, God didn't give Christ wisdom. Christ is our wisdom. He is the wisdom of God. And that is the good news for us. That we now have someone better than Daniel that we can run to whenever we fall, whenever we fail, whenever we realize I have not been faithful when I ought to have been faithful. We can receive forgiveness from Jesus, who is better than Daniel. And that is what we are called to do. We say, if we read in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32, it says, and it begins by saying, and what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire. And verse 39 says, and all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us they should not be perfect. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. That is the good news for you and me, my friends. When we have been unable to be faithful, we can go to Jesus, and he will forgive us. He will strengthen us. He will enable us to live like Daniel and his men in life's challenging situations, and give us the power and strength to do that. Let's pray.